sponsored by Skillshare. All proceeds from this video will be donated to the Equal Justice Initiative.
Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to bring you part 2 of my spring reading wrap-up, but before I get into the books, I did want to note that as the Black Lives Matter movement continues across America and social media and the world, I would encourage you to continue reading, protesting, donating, and supporting structural systemic change however you are able to. I'm going to leave some links and resources in the description box below.
And as I mentioned at the top, all proceeds from this video will be donated to the Equal Justice Initiative linked below, and Skillshare has also kindly agreed to match that donation on their end as well.
And now let's get into some of the books. I wanted to start by mentioning a couple of books that I've done full reviews for recently, the first being Citizen: An American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, which is a stunning work of poetry that features mixed media and formal experimentation and feels incredibly vital not just for this current moment, but for any moment.
The review for that one went up yesterday, so I encourage you to check it out if you're interested.
The other title I reviewed recently was The Odyssey by Homer, translated by Emily Wilson, which is another fairly timeless story, and Wilson's translation really injects a new kind of energy and dynamism into Homer's verse. As I mentioned in that review, I did fall down a kind of Homer hole after reading The Odyssey, and I ordered a copy of the Iliad, and while I was waiting for it to arrive, I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, Memorial by Alice Oswald, and a book about Cy Twombly's 50 Days at Ilium art installation, all of which are their own kind of modern retellings of the Iliad. I really enjoyed all of those and I loved reading them side by side, so I'm going to save my discussion of those titles for an Iliad themed wrap-up once I have read the actual Iliad. But getting into the rest of the books I wanted to talk about today, first up I have Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, aka the Hillary Clinton fan fiction novel. This book tries to answer that tantalizing question that has fascinated and haunted some Americans for decades, which is, what would have happened to Hillary Clinton if she hadn't married Bill? It's an unanswerable question in my opinion because Bill and Hillary's stories are so profoundly intertwined. You could almost argue that at a certain point it just all becomes the same thread, but Sittenfeld does her best to try to untangle their destinies, sort of, and I'm really of a few different minds about this book.
Because I think you can read it in 3 different ways. First, as a piece of mainstream fan fiction, because that's exactly what it is. Second, as a character study of a woman whose public-facing self at this point is a warped amalgamation of various projections. And lastly, as an artifact of what I would describe as the period of national trauma following the 2016 election. In the first aspect, I actually think that the first half to 2/3 of this book are pretty successful. It has all the Easter eggs and winking nods to real events that you would expect from fan fiction.
And it does offer a fairly satisfying and convincing version of how Hillary's life might have unfolded. I should also add that this book has a lot of the smut that you would expect from fan fiction, and I normally don't consider myself that much of a prude, but reading extremely explicit sex scenes about public figures who are still alive was deeply uncomfortable. So bear that in mind. But beyond the fan fiction of it all, as a character portrait and an exploration of the tension between Hillary's private and public selves, I think this book is really hit and miss. Sittenfeld's Hillary feels most vital and most real in the first half of the book, which maybe ironically is when she's falling in and out of love with Bill Clinton. And I think that relationship provides a tension and a conflict and ultimately vilifies Bill in a way that allows Sittenfeld to explore all of the complicated dynamics that are at play in Hillary's character. But in the second half of the novel, Hillary becomes flatter and flatter. And I think that's because when the story starts to line up with that period in time when the real Hillary was emerging on the national scene, Sittenfeld seems like she's not able to either fully depart from or fully excavate the person behind the public figure that we all know.
And then in the final aspect, as a broader kind of post-2016 social political commentary, I think this book is pretty useless.
Spoilers ahead, if you can even say that.
The ending in particular engages in a kind of white feminist wishful thinking that has a lot to say about sexism, but often glosses over the resurgent nationalism and racism and xenophobia that helped carry Trump to victory 4 years ago. And even more insidious, I think, is Sittenfeld's decision to reimagine Trump as this kind of unlikely Hillary surrogate who ultimately helps her get elected, which I think plays into the dangerous but all too common idea that Trump is just this vacuous clown who possesses no real ideology. So most of the last third of this book is baffling at best, and its feel-good ending, which presents the idea of a woman in the White House as a kind of national absolution or national redemption, just rings kind of hollow in 2020.
Switching gears, the next book I want to talk about is Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby, which is her third collection of humorous essays after We Are Never Meeting in Real Life and Meaty. I've read all of Samantha Irby's books and I cannot recommend her highly enough. She is so f***ing funny, and not in that grating, overly self-conscious, I'm a comedian, look at me expertly executing my craft kind of way. Her humor and her tone and her deadpan delivery feel so effortless in a kind of exasperated, shrugging way. Whether she's talking about chronic inflammatory bowel disease or hypothetical 911 calls or detachment parenting her 2 white stepkids. To give you an example, after her horrible cat Helen dies, she briefly contemplates becoming a dog person, only to be pulled once again into the magnetic force field of another deranged asshole cat. She says, "I could feel a cloud of cold air envelop me as Lois led us into the darkened kitty sanctuary. I could hear Helen's deadly groan of disapproval in my ear, and I knew immediately that I was making the right decision. That cat room smelled like my future, like damp pine litter and tuna casserole and the moldy inside of an LL Bean moccasin. And I walked directly to a large cage housing a tiny tortoiseshell kitten who was scaling the bars with her razor-sharp claws, face pressed hard against them as she strained to grab my finger. 'If you take me home, I will end you,' she whispered as a bright spot of blood appeared on my fingertip. 'Lois, I found my soulmate. Ring her up.' I do think this book is not quite as consistently funny as We Are Never Meeting in Real Life and Meaty, both of which are just rock solid. Wow, No Thank You takes an essay or two to get into the really, really funny stuff in this book, and some of the essays here are a little bit listicle heavy, which can occasionally get repetitive. But that being said, Samantha Irby is always a delight, like truly laugh out loud funny, and she also narrates the audiobooks brilliantly, so I highly recommend those as well. Before I get into the next book, as I mentioned earlier, this video is sponsored by Skillshare, which is an online learning platform offering thousands of classes for people who are interested in exploring their creativity, discovering new passions, and developing new skills. Whether it be photo, video, audio editing, baking and cooking classes, writing, or a whole host of other areas of interest and skill sets. A Skillshare class that recently caught my attention was Creative Personal Writing, Write the Real You, which is taught by Ashley C. Ford, who is a writer and speaker that I've been following on social media for years now. And in this class, she talks about things like writing from memory, reporting on yourself, and pulling memory into the present. And it was so fascinating to get some of her insights into her craft and also get a sense of how to implement those insights into a concrete project. Because in addition to their great roster of teachers, Skillshare also will connect you with an online community of millions of other learners, and each class includes projects that will help you grow and develop your creativity in a meaningful way. Most classes are under 60 minutes, and Skillshare is also an incredibly affordable way to learn online, with annual membership coming in at less than $10 a month.
If you're interested in exploring your creativity through Skillshare, the first 1,000 people who click on the link in the description box below will get 2 free months of premium membership.
The next book I wanted to talk about is Thousand Cranes by Yasunari Kawabata, which was first published in Japan in 1952 and translated into English in 1958. I read Snow Country, which is another of Kawabata's most highly regarded novels, a couple of years ago, and I liked it a lot. And actually, my admiration for that book and for Kawabata's writing has only grown over time as I think back on it. And at the time, I remember reading some article from JSTOR that described his books as a cold garden of prose, and I can't not think about that phrase now whenever I think about his writing because it is just so apt. Thousand Cranes is set in Japan outside Tokyo after World War II, and like Snow Country, it follows a young dilettante and his various entanglements with one-dimensional female characters. In this case, our protagonist is Kikuji, who begins an affair with his father's mistress, Mrs. Ota, after his father's death, but he also later becomes involved with Mrs. Ota's daughter, who kind of viewed Kikuji's father as her own kind of father figure as well. So it's incredibly messy and creates this kind of feeling of unease throughout. And at the center of all of it is the recurrence of the traditional Japanese tea ceremony, which in this book is loaded with metaphor and with a kind of cold sensuality. And to be honest, I never really find the plots or characters in Kawabata's books to be particularly memorable, but what I'm always left with are those pristine images, whether it be a lipstick stain on the rim of a tea bowl or a kerchief printed with a thousand crane pattern. And I'm also left with this sense memory of the atmosphere and mood that emanates off of his cold, clean prose. It's the kind of thing that when you think back on it gives you this kind of distant but palpable shiver, which I love. So if that sounds like your kind of thing as well, then I definitely recommend Kawabata and Thousand Cranes. And lastly, I have Open Book by Jessica Simpson, which is her #1 New York Times best-selling memoir, which to my surprise received a lot of great critical praise when it came out earlier this year, followed by a lot of great word-of-mouth buzz among readers. And so I picked up this book mostly on the strength of all of the chatter around it, because Jessica Simpson has always been kind of a peripheral celebrity in my life. She's never really meant anything to me, but I do think her status as a never quite A-lister, always kind of a tier below the Britneys and the Christinas, actually works in this book's favor, because it reads less like she's talking to fans from some lofty pedestal and trying to project or maintain a certain image, and more like catching up with someone you went to high school with who you keep tabs on social media but haven't talked to in years. And it was honestly like a shockingly fascinating and compulsive read. And some of that is because there is a lot of good juicy gossip about people like Nick Lachey and Tony Romo and John Mayer. Jesus Christ, John Mayer. And as you read, you will definitely find yourself going back and looking up old tabloid stories and pictures and clips of newlyweds on YouTube, which is gonna up your suggested videos for a long time. But I think what ultimately elevates this book over your typical celebrity memoir really is how honest she is and how thoughtful and self-aware she is, especially when she's talking about things like alcohol dependence or the relentless public commentary on her body or the toxic aspects of certain relationships that you can't always see until years after the fact. I don't know, I came away from this book just feeling like Jessica Simpson really has her head screwed on straight. And I think for someone who was always kind of cast in the media as the ditz or the hot girl or the not hot enough mom jeans girl, it's really lovely actually to see her force you to reconsider that and see her as this fully dimensional person. I also wanted to quickly mention a few other things I picked up this spring. The first is In the Woods by Tana French. At the beginning of the year, I mentioned wanting to read more crime fiction since that's a genre that I normally try to avoid. So I picked up Tana French based on the way that people talk about the strength of her writing and characters. So I read about 170 pages of this at the very beginning of quarantine, and I did really enjoy it, but then because I truly cannot not spoil myself. I looked up the ending, which was kind of underwhelming, and after that I put it down for a bit and then just never picked it back up again. So I did kind of kill my own momentum on that one, but I also think that my enthusiasm waned a bit because those tropes of the crime fiction genre, i.e. the small town murder, the brooding detective with the mysterious past, the will they, won't they probably won't, but if they do, it'll be a terrible mistake, sort of sexual tension between detectives. Although Tana French does those tropes really well, I think I realized that I don't necessarily find them compelling in and of themselves, at least not enough to make me want to finish the book. In my winter reading wrap-up, I also mentioned that I was reading Moby Dick by Herman Melville as part of a book group, and at the time I believe I said,
I have committed to reading the whole thing, so I will not be bailing out of that boat.
yeah, I bailed on that one like the second quarantine started because I didn't really like it. In the past few weeks, I have also picked up Blindness by Jose Saramago and Sula by Toni Morrison, both of which I'm really enjoying and will definitely finish, so I'll talk more about those in my next wrap-up. Those are all the books I've been reading lately. Let me know if you've read any of them, if you have thoughts on them, and let me know what kinds of books you've been turning to lately. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!